The early doyens of personality typing were psychotherapists who developed theories based primarily on narrative explanations of thought, with a particular interest in speculative subconscious processes. They tested their ideas using introspection and anecdotal personal observations of others. The most influential of these was Carl Jung. In his book of 1921, Psychological Types, he proposed that there are two psychological attitudes, extroversion and introversion, and four psychological functions. The functions are divided into two perceiving functions, sensation and intuition, and two decision-making or judging functions, thinking and feeling. He theorized that people have a preference for one or the other attitude and for one of the four functions, forming their personality type, giving 8 personality types. Jung also theorized that the opposite attitudes and functions to those preferred were suppressed and determined the behavior of the subconscious. Jung believed that someone's personality type is fixed from an early age and cannot be altered other than by extreme psychological events or brain disease. He thought that the different personality types have good and bad features. In everyday life, we present to the world a persona that attempts to conceal the shortcomings of our own personality, while allowing our strengths to be seen. This process of maintaining a different persona from our underlying personality requires a degree of psychological effort. According to Jung, our mental capacity is strictly limited, and when we are under stress, we have little spare capacity to maintain our persona, and our outward behavior reverts to that native of our personality, called reverting to type. Jung's complex model of personality, involving hierarchical attitudes and functions, and their operation in subconscious and conscious domains, is now largely of historical interest. But the dichotomies he proposed and the idea of reversion to type under stress have proved more durable and a rich source of theory and experiment. Outside of psychology, some common personality classifications used today are based on derivatives of Jung's model. The 4 dichotomies lead to 16 possible combinations with 16 corresponding personality types. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is an adaptation of Jung's classification, developed by Catherine Cook Briggs and her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers, to assist in the placement of women into industry during the Second World War. It was first published in 1962. Briggs and Myers took Jung's 4 dichotomies to produce 16 types. While using the same function names used by Jung, they had slightly different meanings in mind. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, is a commercial product aimed to develop understanding of differences. Much of the information on it is controlled by the company that sells it. It has been criticized by academics, but remains one of the most frequently used tools throughout industry and in the public sector. It can be used in 2 ways, formal and informal. The formal way involves completing the commercial questionnaires in a facilitated session with an approved trainer. Answers are combined to give the 4 preferences and an index of the certainty of each one. The informal way involves a text that describes what is meant by the 4 dichotomies and then asks respondents to classify themselves. They then read summaries of their and other personality types. Respondents often find these summaries to be insightful and accurate descriptions of themselves. David Keirsey was an American psychologist who developed a personality classification system that has a hierarchical structure with 4 main temperaments, 8 roles, and 16 role variants. It classifies people according to how they deal with 4 aspects of life, namely thought, order, feelings, and other people. Keirsey coordinated and developed previous ideas of personality typing and, as with Jung and the MBTI, used 4 dichotomies. We will return to Keirsey, but firstly we need to look at the criticisms that are applied to these Jungian systems. First, there is test-retest reliability. This refers to how well 2 tests done on the same person at different times produce similar results. For the MBTI, test-retest reliability varies from just over 80% to under 40%, the consistency declining with a longer time between tests. This suggests that, contrary to Jung's beliefs, such tests are not of unchanging lifelong characteristics. Some have suggested that the belief that personality does not change over time is part of a pervasive cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error, which refers to the tendency to see others' actions as being personality-driven and stable, while seeing our own actions as more dependent on circumstances. This pattern of attribution tends to become more pronounced where actions have adverse outcomes. Second, there is dichotomy. A characteristic like extroversion is not an all or none phenomenon, but it forms a continuous spectrum from extreme extroversion at one end to extreme introversion at the other. The distribution of the variable along this spectrum is a bell curve, with extreme cases being rare and the majority being nearer the middle. Modelling this as a dichotomy is not entirely satisfactory because it fails to distinguish between the extreme case, whose personality is dominated by that one trait, and the more typical intermediate case. One particular distribution issue is with Keirsey's use of the sensing versus intuitive dichotomy, which gives 75 to 85% of the population as sensing. The UK norms based on the MBTI version of the dichotomies show that 76% of the general population and 53% of those involved in management are sensing. Thirdly, the problem of definition affects all personality classification systems to some extent, but particularly Jungian ones. What is meant by the 8 terms making up the 4 dichotomies is not the same from one system to another, nor is it the same as their common English meaning. Extra explanation with potential for misunderstanding is necessary in order to use these classification systems. Fourthly, evidence. There are 4 methods of evidence generation in personality studies: one-to-one case studies, questionnaires from large numbers of respondents, observational studies, and laboratory experiments. All have their strengths and weaknesses. Jungian systems are primarily based on only one of these, namely one-to-one case studies. This method has the advantage of in-depth detailed analysis, but the disadvantages of subjectivity, inter-observer variation, and consequently limited repeatability. Mainstream psychology favours systems informed by repeatable lines of evidence generation, such as the 5-factor model. Lastly, practical value. A common doubt raised by healthcare professionals about the value of personality testing is that it has little or no practical value. In the terms of academic psychology, this is referred to as the limitation of predictive value. Claims made for personality typing systems often maintain that they can, for example, be used to optimally deploy people on a team, or predict responses to psychological treatment modalities, and so on. And these claims, particularly when made for commercial typing products, are often unduly exaggerated. The predictive value of testing falls into 2 categories: tautological and non-tautological. Tautological prediction means that if somebody reports a particular trait, that trait is likely to be true of them at the time of reporting and in the future. As an example, if a person has a rational temperament and reports that they prefer abstract logical thought to detailed observation, this is highly predictive that they will give the same report if asked again a year later. This relatively successful tautological prediction of personality typing systems is a consequence of the relative constancy of people's personality types. Predictive value generally becomes weaker as the link between the reported trait and behavior becomes more distant. For example, someone preferring order to novelty is likely to have a tidy desk, but the link to desk tidiness is not as strong as it is to continuing to report a preference for order over novelty at a later date. As the link between reported characteristics and behavior becomes weaker, the predictive value of all personality typing systems also becomes weaker. A good example of this is the Type AB system, in which Type A personality characteristics are claimed to be predictive of the apparently totally unrelated risk of coronary artery disease. This claim is controversial, and it's generally true that when tested, the ability of personality typing systems to predict behavior not directly related to the reported preferences is weak. The predictive value of testing can also be seen in terms of group and individual prediction. Group prediction refers to the ability to predict performance on a group basis. For example, a group of 100 individuals scoring high on extroversion are likely to perform better in a sales role than a group of 100 individuals scoring high on introversion. Individual prediction refers to whether one person will perform better than another. This is clearly a more difficult task than group prediction, both statistically and practically. In the two groups mentioned, some of the introverts will perform better than some of the extroverts. The criticism that personality typing has little useful application in healthcare systems is usually based on the failure of non-tautological prediction, but it is the tautological rather than non-tautological prediction that is of interest to us. Our hypothesis of the value of personality typing in a healthcare environment is nothing more than this. A more detailed understanding of people's strengths, weaknesses, likes and dislikes enables a more effective allocation of tasks in a way that optimizes their efficient completion, ensuring the engagement and satisfaction of all team members.